am delighted to welcome to the Library of Congress's National Book Festival the acclaimed authors Ishmael Beah and Maaza Mengiste. It is lovely to speak with both of you today. How are you doing?
Great. It's really great to be here, Hope. And Ishmael, it's wonderful to see you again.
I'm honored to be speaking with the two of you, so I'm looking forward to it. So thank you.
Thank you. I am incredibly honored, and I just want to start out by thanking you both for your work. All of your work is incredible, but these particular last two novels especially are such gifts, such gifts. So thank you for the work you do. Thank you for the voice you are in the world. Thank you. To begin, I would like to ask you a few questions about the craft in your work, the structural choices you made while writing your books. If I may read a short passage of each of your books so that the audience can hear what we're talking about, no longer than a paragraph, and then ask you some craft questions. She does not want to remember, but she is here, and memory is gathering bones. She has come by foot and by bus to Addis Ababa, across terrain she has chosen to forget for nearly 40 years. She is 2 days early, but she will wait for him, seated on the ground in this corner of the train station, the metal box on her lap, her back pressed against the wall, rigid as a sentinel. She has put on the dress she does not wear every day. Her hair is neatly braided and sleek, and she has been careful to hide the long scar that puckers at the base of her neck and trails over her shoulder like a broken necklace. That being the first paragraph of The Shadow King, I want to also read the first paragraph of Little Family. If you are to walk toward a field that lies at the edge of the small town of Faloya, when the sun is awake in the sky, you will hear the breeze whistling through the grasses, parting the dry and green strands as it makes its way to you. Or maybe you will think it is the rustling of someone hiding under the vast shrubs. At the end of the field, your eyes will light upon the face of a boy among the grasses, peering intently at something. You try to see what it is by following the trail of his gaze, but you see nothing. Hello, you say. The boy does not respond, only narrows his eyelids against the wind. You stare back at his face, in which youth is steeped in something serious and old, in stories you want to know. You try your luck again. Such chills from both of those openings, which are so fantastic. In both of these, I was so struck by the gorgeous use of imagery and the musicality of language. And with The Shadow King, that repetition of she does, she, that 3-part repetition. I was hoping to ask both of you if you could talk about a little bit of this craft and structural choices that you made, either on a sentence level, imagery, the overarching structure of the book, whatever you would like.
Ishmael, do you want to take that first? By the way, that was beautiful. That was absolutely a beautiful opening paragraph, Ishmael. I would love to hear this because Hope, you and I went to grad school together. And one of the things that I learned in grad school, supposedly, was that you do not write a book or a story in second person. And Ishmael, this worked so well. I'd love to, please go first. I would love to hear it.
But, I think, I love the opening of yours too. I think I actually sent you a text about it when I was reading your book, Maaza, and I said, it's opening, it's so beautiful and brilliant. It captures your imagination right away, and you're right there with her. You don't want to leave the story after that. So in my case, I think for me, when I start writing a story, first of all, I think there are several things to know is that my characters never speak English to me. So that being said, structure falls out of place in that sense. I have not, since I started writing, I have not had characters that speak English to me. They usually speak the languages that I know in Sierra Leone, from Sierra Leone, from other African countries, and then I try to translate that into English, which is the language that I write in. And so when I wanted to write this story, one of the things I really wanted is to, within the story itself, to give the characters agency, because often African characters, when others write about us, we don't have agency. So I wanted the story to start that way, as almost an invitation into the story by the characters telling you, this is how we're going to tell you our story. We're going to invite you into our world on our own account, and you're going to listen to it this way, not the way you whatever your preconceived ideas are about us, it's not going to fly. So that was the intent behind that decision to start the book this way. It's a very short piece, and it invites you into their world, and then after that you start to meet them. So that was the technique. It's like, come and hear our story, and we're going to tell it to you this way. Are you coming? Don't ask questions. We will tell you what you need to know. That's it.
It's interesting that, Hope, you talked about the musicality of this, because I envisioned the novel as a orchestral structure. I mean, I envisioned many voices. There's a chorus that's also part of the book, and I wanted even the opening to, without it, I didn't say it to anyone. It wasn't obvious, but even the opening is a retelling by the chorus, who will eventually step in and become more intrusive as the story continues. But in a sense, they're looking at Hirut in 1974, and before she starts wandering back in her memory to 1935. So I wanted the presence of that chorus to still be there in some way. So that opening chapter, I always felt it was their voice talking. And that repetition of the you that you meant, or she that you mentioned, feels to me like a musical device. Those repetitions that become moments of pause before you launch into the next part of this song or refrain. And that's just how I heard it. Ishmael said something really interesting about he doesn't hear his characters, the stories don't come to him in English first. And I went to school in an English system, first British and then American. So my entire educational background, history, even reading, has been in English. But when I hear English, particularly when I'm writing, I hear the English that is spoken by Ethiopians, which is also has these inflections that is like a song. The voices tend to be expressive, and American English is very flat. Like, even the way I say the word flat is flat. It's ugly. Sorry. But the way that my family speaks when they speak English, and the way that I've heard other Ethiopians speak, it's like a song. The voices move up and down. There's a freedom in the voice. And I wanted to reflect that also in the way that the English is written in the book.
That's just fantastic. I want to ask you another question about the craft in your work. You both do such lovely and fascinating work with character. In these sections I read, we look so closely at an individual and are brought into the novel by the close, focused intensity of detail of character. And the characters make us care, and they lead us through these plots, moving across time and space and connecting. Just the way the characters form this surrogate family, little family, is so heartbreaking and beautiful and real, and you connect to it. Watching Hirut navigate this space, is just so compelling. So I wanted to both ask you if you could talk more about your characters and how you craft your characters. I know, Ishmael, you talked a little bit about how they speak to you, not in English. And as you talk about character, could you also talk about plot? How do you craft your plots? How do you come up with your plots? The necessity of character and plot in your work.
I'm going to let Maaza go this time around first.
I knew you were going to say that. Um, with Hirut, I had to think about, this is 1935. My novel's set in 1935. It is, it's the start of a war. Mussolini is invading, and there's a mobilization call that everyone has to come, enlist in the army or offer to help in order to save Ethiopia, to save their country. And I started thinking about what Hirut, who is a girl who lives in a village, who has never been maybe farther from her home than she can walk in a day, which might, let's say 5 kilometers is an average, to the market and back, and maybe a little bit beyond. How does she envision a country? What is a country to her? When people say you need to defend your country, I imagined her thinking as she begins to understand the tensions that are in the household in which she works, in which she's a maid with no real freedoms. When somebody says you need to keep your country free, number one, what is freedom for her? And number two, what is a country? And pretty early on in the book, she begins to realize that she says, I am my own country. Isn't a girl worth as much as a country? And I think I imagined her and began to reimagine her as a girl who conceives of her body and herself as an entire world that she will defend as if it were a country. And I imagined, the book is set in 1935, but one of the questions that has always preoccupied me as a writer is what happens after conflict? What happens after war, after revolution, after domestic violence, after these moments of encounters that are brutal? What happens afterwards? And I wanted to start the book decades after this 1935 war, to begin to understand what one woman might still carry with her in her body, on herself, so long after something is apparently finished and Ethiopia was declared victorious. So the book begins in 1974, but Hirut is thinking really of herself, and that section you read hope so beautifully about her scar on her neck that's like a broken necklace. I wanted to have something on her body that she could not get rid of, even though the war is supposedly over. Every time she looks at herself, she has to think about everything that happened.
Well, on my end, the way I approach creating characters and plots is I basically come up with a question I want to answer, an idea I want to explore. And then I start thinking about the characters that I want to use to do that. And so maybe I'll spend 6 months later, sometimes a year, just thinking about those characters. What do they look like? What is their age? What's their gender? Where do they live? And I just make notes to myself. I don't commit to anything. And then one day I would just sit down and start writing the stories. And that's how I do it. I don't necessarily have any mapping, because in my case, because I also come from the oral tradition storytelling, I believe that when you inhabit characters and you allow yourself to be surprised by what they bring to you, you would do more than if you decide that they're going to do X, Y, Z ahead of time. Then you kind of take away the magic of writing itself, which is, as you write, you discover yourself, how you thought, what your blind spots are, So in my case, for example, I wanted to answer the question of freedom for young people nowadays, particularly young people in contemporary Africa. How do you define what freedom means for you with the competing ideas of tradition, export and import of ideas, things that you see on technology, social media things? How do you form yourself with the right value system, but define what freedom means for you in an environment where the concept may not even exist? And so I started thinking about this. And one time I was going back home in Sierra Leone, and it's one of those days where you're fortunate enough to have your flight leave on time from the connection you're doing wherever in Europe. And I was able to land during the daytime. You all can relate to that. I was able to land during the daytime and saw the carcass of this airplane along the Lunge International Airport in Freetown. And I thought to myself, I didn't even think Sierra Leone had an airplane. This is not something we heard in history. We used to have an airline. So then I started talking about it because I know people and it's my country. I could find a way to that airplane without people thinking I was up to anything. You don't want to go wandering near airports, even for research, So I saw the plane and I began to imagine what it would feel like to live on that plane. If there's a group of young people who, through circumstances, ostracize themselves from society, where would they live to decide how they want to be free? So that's how I started. But what was very important for me, for the first time in this book, I've written about characters before that are women, but not the central character. And this is the first time my central character was a woman, but she was a younger transitioning into womanhood, sort of learning about what her femininity means. And clearly, I don't know those things. So I really had to learn even how to describe how a woman feels about wearing a shirt, a clothes, a blouse, what that feels like. I think for men, we're very functional dresses. So I have to get in the emotion of all of that. So for me, it was really, whenever I write, that's what I do. I get into the headspace, into the psychology of the characters, and I inhabit them. I become them, and I check myself as well. And my wife, who is a wonderful first reader, is always the one, when I would give her a draft, she would say, a woman would not say that or think about it. So I realized during writing this book that I know nothing about women. I never thought I knew. At least I had some idea. But also because I'm a father to two daughters who are very young, I think it also brought an urgency to how I wrote this character, to be as strong and as independent a thinker and a doer as she would be. And this really came from, one last point that I'll make, came from, I was on the ferry from Gorée Island in Senegal into Dakar, and my daughter was about a year and a half old, my first daughter, and she's now 6. And there were some older men and some young guys on the other side, and they were basically speaking out loud, as people usually do in this context, so you can hear them, but not directly speaking to you, saying that, but how come they didn't pierce her ear so we know immediately she's a girl? We know she's a girl, but they should pierce her ear. And I remember how this tormented me. And this kind of led into how I decided to write this character, because I thought, what business is there for a man to determine how a woman even decides to express herself? Why shouldn't it be easy for the man to understand that? Why should man even consider speaking about that? So again, for me, my imagination is always informed by the places I've lived, the conversations I overhear, how people are operating, and I bring all of that into the characters that I write in, particularly to answer the questions I want to answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just wisdom drop this session. People take notes. I wanted to follow that up with the question that you led us into, Maaza, speaking with your work, which is, both of these novels deal to a certain degree with erasure, with looking at perhaps what has been hidden or not seen in a certain way, and unearthing that and centering that. And I wanted to ask you, both of you write about the disappeared, the hidden, the erased. Can you please talk a little bit about this?
Ishmael, do you want to take this one first?
Well, you can do it, Maaza. You can do it. Lead the way.
We're two polite Africans. That's a really good question, Hope. I have to think. I have a photographer in this book, and part of the reason that I chose to incorporate an Italian soldier who has a camera that goes into this war of 1935 and documents various atrocities was I saw those photographs. I was looking at photographs that Italian soldiers would take. Some of them are very casual. They're just photographs of a market, or a group of them around a tent, or with some Ethiopians or East Africans, and they feel very innocent. And of course, there were also photographs that colonial forces often take of women and girls in different compromising situations. And I've often wondered, in those photos that feel the most innocent, what's not apparent in that frame. if we imagine that we take photographs in order to remember events, then photographs of war are curated memories. These are things, these are photographs that the soldiers wanted to bring home with them because they wanted to remember the war this way, but not the other way, which is also, you know, those images that maybe they hid or that were kept private, or some that they never took, you know, of their experiences. And I wondered about those erasures, the way that photographs introduce us to what's most visible in a moment, but also hint at those invisibilities that are resting just outside the frame. And it's one of the challenges that I set for myself while I was writing this book is, you know, I didn't want to show a physical photograph, but I wanted to describe it in such a way that you understand that a photograph contains many stories that are never told. And sometimes we don't know how to look, and we don't know how to look at what's there. If only we knew. So I was playing around with that field of invisibility or indiscernibility, maybe that's the word, that photographs and memory often present for us.
Wow, yeah. Well, for me, I have, I started writing out of frustration. And the frustration was the fact that the people who were presenting us, whether through newspaper articles, through exposés, through photographs, through whatever medium, through video, we're always missing the very essential human context of our lives. And therefore, that led to a lot of misunderstanding, misperception of who we are, For example, I remember thinking to myself, how come is it that whenever people speak about African people, there's no really romance stories in African stories? It's as if it doesn't exist. But yet I grew up watching my uncle and my grandfather dance with my grandmother in the evening to a battery-operated cassette tape all night long in our arms. And these were my first ideas of romance. But yet we didn't see that about us, When I started about my own experiences of the war in Sierra Leone, people who wrote about us portrayed us as if we just woke up one morning and we all went to fight. There's no context. We're just like that. So there's a kind of dehumanization that happens when we don't actually think about the points of view of people who write about us who are not us, and the things that are left unsaid. So I started writing to actually fill that gap, to complete the story in a way, to show that, well, guess what? We're complicated, we're multifaceted, we're all these things as well, even though you don't see that. So let me bring you into that world a little bit. So for me, that's what I always do when I try to write, is to open that small window into the lives of the other that you may not know about, so that you can come and find wisdom there as well. I also grew up really understanding, for me, that stories are medicine. And each time you tell a story, you pour that medicine into humanity to strengthen it to be better than it is already. So for many years, I think all of us African writers, whether we live in the diaspora or we live back home, that's what we've been trying to do, is to write these wisdoms, to bring people into these ideas, other ways of living that are not predominant, And lastly, I wanted to start seeing people that are not just Johns and the Smiths in literature. I want to see Mohammed, Abdul, Maaza, Herut. I want to see these kinds of names in literature, because so that we can also see ourselves. So white children, when they read a book, can see Kema or Kailondo or Kudimata in literature, not just the Johns and the Smiths, because I grew up reading those things. I went to British school where you felt like, well, what about us, I'm sure when whatever colonials came to our countries, we already existed before that. So what about our stories as well? So for me, this has always been, that's the work that I'm doing. I feel like by the time whatever books I managed to write in my lifetime, if any African child or Black child can pick it up and see themselves in that character, the mannerisms, the name that's familiar to them, that for me, it's very, very important and crucial. More so now than ever, actually. So,
if I may ask one last question, thank you for pointing out the erasure and whose stories get written over. There's a saying that says, until until the lion can tell his story, history will always favor the hunter. And that idea that, until this erasure and marginalization is going to continue to happen until we push back against it. Sorry, not until, but you are continuously pushing back against it. And so my last question to you is this. Toni Morrison says, during times like these, and I'm sure you know this quote already, but I'll read it for the fun of it. This is precisely the time. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no room for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. And I wanted to ask you, because you're both already doing this work through your activism with the UN and so many other countless resources. Both of you are doing so much activism work through your empowerment of other writers, specifically writers of color, through your work that you're writing. So my last question to you is, where do we go from here? There's, as you both beautifully said, there are so many very troubling, very distressing systems and ways of moving through this crisis, these crises that we're experiencing that have deep foundational roots, and that will continue to echo forward in this kind of violent way. How can we do something different?
Well, it's a big question, but I would take a stab at it. Is that starting with the quote, "Until lions learn to speak," the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. When I was in university, I wasn't studying writing. I was actually studying political science and economics. But I started a reading group with a Zimbabwean friend of mine, and this was our title, because we thought that, and rightly as the quote said, the hunter will always say, "Yeah, I chased that lion, got down," but the lion can explain their side of the story. It would be a completely different story, right? So we started doing that as a way to, I mentioned earlier, not only to take ownership, but to complete the story. Because I think anybody who goes into any situation is always going to have their POV, but people are never honest about that. They make it factual. I saw them this way and therefore they are this way. Now I'll bring it back to the question of how do we move forward? I think how do we move forward, particularly for Black children? I think we need to infuse not only Black children, but older people. We need Black consciousness. We need people to know that there's a knowledge that we already own, that exists, that we can build upon, so that when our children face other people, they come prepared with their history, with their background, knowing who they are fully. We're not represented in the way people speak about even knowledge. For example, look at what happened during this pandemic. The world did not ask African countries about knowledge about how to deal with pandemics, but yet we've dealt with so much. We have knowledge because we're not looked at as having people who have solutions to give to anybody. We need to change how that is. As a writer, I'm sure Maaza can attest to this. You know how many times you have to fight to be on panels to discuss craft. Usually as an African writer, you're brought on panels to talk about the war or the uprising in this place or this problem or that problem, but not about craft, as if you can talk about craft. So there are all these little microaggressions that happen that diminishes who we are. And I think, as Maaza said, we're just starting to see that. And we should build on doing that in how we speak, what we speak about, how we position ourselves, so that people can begin to see us and understand us. We've always been there, Now, I am speaking as a Black man, which my situation is not amazing, but it's better. For Black women, it's even more work that needs to be done. And I also speak from a father who has 2 Black daughters. I want them to grow up with their brilliance shining and not diminished. So I think that's this is the work we need to do. We need to write and talk and create spaces. Maaza already is part of the Afrolit Sans Frontier that started to do that kind of stuff, to showcase we've always been here. Here we are. See us and learn. And lastly, we should be very wary, because there are so many people who think that just by reading a book about racism, makes them already know the issue now. It's not sufficient. If you're 45, 30, 50, and you're only realizing that this has existed, you need to ask yourself why. Has it benefited you? That's why you did not pay attention. That's where the conversation starts. We give anybody a little pass, it's just going to be a small band-aid, and the problem will continue.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you, Ishmael, for that. Just to continue, because I completely agree with everything that you've said. I think one of the things I've been thinking about, I think one of the questions that all of us asked ourselves when this pandemic hit is, what's on the other side? How will the world look when we get out of this? I think we imagined that the world would just, I don't know, that this was a brief blip and then we were going to go back and things would work relatively the same way. But very soon we realized this is going to be completely different. Life is going to change completely. And I remember talking with friends of mine very early on about, what do you imagine the world looking like? And then we realized, actually, the question is, what am I going to be like at the end of this? And how can I create the world that I envision? And part of that, the Afro Lit Sans Frontières, which is a collective of writers, some writers from the continent, some who live in different parts of the world, but some who also live in Africa, different parts of Africa. We came together and said, let's do something. And I think what's happening, and Ishmael, I would love to maybe get some thoughts from you, but I think that what's happening is that writers from the continent of Africa, even African writers in the diaspora, are looking less to the West and beginning to look towards each other to create something that's not saying to the West, look at us, but saying to each other, let's talk. Let's see what we can do. So we're not constantly distracted by trying to get attention on this side. We're actually doing work and we are paying attention to each other and we're creating for each other. I cannot speak to all of the literature that has been published or that is popular right now in Angola. But because I am now more aware of writers who are writing in Portuguese, who are from Angola or Mozambique, or, suddenly my world is completely open. And the writers that I'm in conversation with are not looking towards the West. They're looking towards other African writers and saying, let's talk. Let's talk about the work we're doing and how can we form collectives and do publishing, translation, these Zoom meetings. How can we do festivals that basically say to the West, you're not asking us the questions that we want to be asked. We're going to speak to ourselves. And I have to say, Hope, that this session has been fabulous because you started this with a discussion of craft. And I cannot tell you how rare that is. So this is amazing. And this is what happens when we have conversations with people who don't see us in terms of a token representing either an entire continent or just one country. So let's learn about the country before we can begin to understand your work. Well, screw that. I don't need to understand Oklahoma to read a writer from there. So this has been really wonderful.
Thank you, Maaza. Thank you, Ishmael, and thank you, Maaza, for saying that. I deliberately start with craft questions. It's a very specific choice because, as Ishmael and you both said, African writers are asked about what is it like to be an African writer, or to represent an atrocity or a token, and to get rid of that othering, center this gaze. Center this voice, center this perspective, and really revel in the brilliance that is created when we look to read from this lens rather than putting a kind of white or Western lens and reading through there. And, the brilliance of the Shadow King, the brilliance of Little Family just shine an immense light in the world. And the work that these books are doing as art objects, but also as purveyors of a deep and essential truth that we all need to hear, not just now, but at all times. So I want to thank you again for your time this morning, and thank you again for these beautiful books that you have shared with us. They are gifts, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so much.
Maaza.
Thank you, Ishmael. Thank you, Hope.